So without any further ado, welcome along to In Conservation with myself, David Lindo. And tonight, we have a very special guest. His name is Dave Goulson. In fact, it should be Professor Dave Goulson, shouldn't it?
I guess, if you like.
Well, okay, we'll go with Dave, I suppose, to make him less formal, because that's how we try and do things here on this particular show. I just wanted to firstly thank the sponsors, one of them for the final time this year, and that's King's Place Music Foundation, and this is part of their Nature Unwrapped season. And basically, their season ends actually now with this particular episode. So thank you very much for supporting us for most of this year. And Leica Sport Optics as well. So thank you very much for your involvement. Now, many of you may not have heard of Dave. He's a very big name within the world of entomology. But I admit I've not met you before, Dave. And we've seen, maybe we have met, but I've got a very short memory. But we haven't crossed paths, have we, really? Do you know?
I don't think so, no. The world of insects is quite a small one, I guess.
Yeah, like the insects. You are a professor of biology at University of Sussex, specialising in bee ecology. And he's published more than 300 scientific articles on ecology and conservation of bumblebees, as well as other insects. And you are the author of Bumblebees, Their Behaviour, Ecology and Conservation, which was published in 2010. And you've also published a bestseller, which is amazing, Sunday Times bestseller, A Sting in the Tail, which is a popular science book about bumblebees, which was published in 2013 and now translated into 14 different languages. That's amazing. What's the most weirdest language?
Oh, Chinese,
not weirdest,
Korean, Taiwanese. Sorry, I'm talking over you now, but yeah, just Czech was the most recent. But the Asian ones, I got copies of them in Korean and Taiwanese, and obviously I don't even know which way to hold the book up. It's kind of weird seeing your own words in a completely alien script.
Yeah, it must be weird. Anyway, you've got a lot of accolades, and one of the most interesting accolades, as far as I'm concerned, is the fact that you were named number 8, ladies and gentlemen, in the BBC Wildlife magazine list of the top 50 most influential people in nature and conservation. You and I were in that list, weren't we?
It's a little bit weird. I have no idea how they make that list. I think they pluck names out of a hat or something, but it was really cool.
Listen, I've been dining out on it since 2015, so don't knock it. I mean, I'm 7, you're 8. We're both kind of equal. So,
do you know? There's been a newer list since then, I guess, hasn't there?
No more lists. We need to keep that list forever. No more new lists. So, and also, you've been named as highly cited researcher by the Thomas ISI. What is the ISI, by the way? Thomas ISI.
Oh, it's a sort of organization that counts the number of citations that we get, which basically every time you write a scientific paper, the kind of reference list at the end, the papers you are citing. And so my papers have been cited by lots of other people. Basically, it's all very boring, and but in scientific circles, it's valued as a sign that at least somebody's bothering to read your work, I guess.
Okay, cool. Before we go any further in terms of our conversation about insects, I've got to make 2 confessions tonight, Dave, if you don't mind. Confession number 1, I don't know too much about insects, even though my natural history, sort of my first kind of connection with nature and what have you was through invertebrates, but I don't know much, really. Number 2, I think I was single-handedly responsible for the decline of the bumblebee, certainly in the 70s. Because
manage that.
Because I was conducting some scientific experiments in my garden when I was a kid, and we had a water butt, and I was quite curious. I wondered if bumblebees could swim. So I got a Coke bottle, an empty Coke bottle, and I duly walked around the garden, picking up the bumblebees with my hands and stuffing them into the bottle. And soon I had a bottle filled with bumblebees. And then I poured the bees into the barrel, and all of them drowned. And I learned an expensive lesson. I was really guilty about it until I learned about Sir Peter Scott and how he used to shoot geese until one day he shot one and it got injured and he realized, what am I doing? And that was my what am I doing moment. And I think from that moment on, at the tender age of 7, I think I became a conservationist. So I hope you can forgive me for murdering quite a lot of bees in the name of science there.
I've got a slightly similar story. But I had slightly better motives than you, or maybe more sensible ones. I found a load of wet bumblebees. I don't think you'd been there, but that had been caught out in the rain, and they were all soggy and bedraggled, and they couldn't fly. And I was similar age. I think I was about 7 or 8, and I thought I'd dry them out. So I took them inside and put them on. We had one of these old electric cookers with our hot plates that take ages to warm up. So I put them on the hot plate, and I made a little tissue blanket and put it over them, and then turned it on the lowest setting. But got bored because they take 10 minutes to warm up. So I kind of wandered off, and then, you can guess what happened. Next thing I knew, there was smoke billowing from the cooker and then burst into flames. So yeah. Anyway, children do these things, and I've been trying to make up for it since.
Talking about children, I mean, how did you sort of get yourself interested, A, in natural history and B, in insects?
I didn't, consciously try. I just was. I was just born that way. I don't know. And a lot of us are, I think. Some of my earliest memories are of collecting. I remember spotting these little caterpillars, little yellow and black stripy caterpillars they were on some weeds in the school playground at a primary school, and I stuck them in my lunchbox and took them home and reared them up, and they eventually turned into these really beautiful red and black moths, cinnabar moths, for anyone who knows their moths. And I thought that was just a kind of magic, and so I've been hooked ever since, and I just never grew out of that kind of childhood enthusiasm. And I think, that a lot of naturalists are like that, from Charles Darwin to David Attenborough to whoever, it's just some of us are born with this kind of fascination with nature. And I think some people do sort of leave it behind as they grow up, but some of us don't, thankfully.
Yeah. Last night we had Alison Stedman here, and she also loves insects, and I was talking to her about insects, and I asked her a question. I said, did you ever eat ants? And she looked horrified. So I'm asking the same question. Did you ever eat ants as a kid?
I didn't eat ants as a kid, but I have since eaten chocolate-coated ants, which aren't bad actually, but obviously it's the chocolate rather than the ant that is tasty. And I know it sounds a bit grim, but there's something to be said for eating insects. There are companies that are trying to manufacture food from mass-reared insects, not wild-caught insects. That I don't think that would be such a wise idea. But to be fair, nothing made from insects I've ever eaten was very nice. But time will tell whether someone can produce something that actually tastes good. But environmentally, there are big advantages of eating insects compared to eating beef, say.
Yeah. I licked the bum of an ant.
What? Sorry.
It's a family show, by the way. An ant in Australia, and it tasted like lime, which is, it took me a lot of effort to do it because I was screaming, but it actually did taste quite sweet or sour, actually, lime. But that's the nearest I've got, apart from maybe I did eat ants as a kid, but I can't remember. I know some of my friends did. But as a kid, did you not find insects kind of, look at that, it's horrible? Or did you just find them beautiful the whole time? Or did you have no problem picking them up?
On the whole, actually, just before we leave Australia, in Australia, the Aboriginal peoples routinely eat ants. There's a species of ant in Australia called the honeypot ant, where they they have special individual workers who specialize in being a living honeypot. So they hang from the roof of the underground chambers where this ant lives, and they never move. They just get fed nectar by the other workers, and their body swells and swells until it's the size of about a grape, just full of honey. And the ant itself can't move at all. It just clings onto the roof of the cage, and it's a living honey store. But the Aboriginal peoples know where to find them and dig them up and then eat these great big, very sweet ants. David Attenborough did it on telly once as well. But anyway, sorry, I did. Yeah, I know. I mean, some of them are a bit creepy. You can't get away from it. I mean, actually, not so much insects, but I must admit, I find some other arthropods, some insect relatives, things like some of the spiders and scorpions and so on I've come across in my travels, slightly harder to like, shall I say.
Yeah, because I think the one that I'm afraid of the most actually is the camel spider.
Yeah, they're terrifying, I must admit. Very fast moving as well, which adds to their kind of effect. But yeah, there are some fearsome creatures in the world. Thankfully, we don't. In the UK, we have a very tame fauna, don't we? There's nothing to be frightened of at all, really.
Yeah, I mean, but I have got a camel spider stories. So maybe later, maybe in the Q&A afterwards, I can tell you it. But it's quite a long one, really. But anyway, we're here to talk about insects. I'm really quite keen, as with I suppose all the Zoomers here, to learn more about your take on them. I just wondered if you could perhaps take us through your PowerPoint and tell us more. And before you actually do, whilst you're getting it all up, just to tell everyone in the room, the Zoomers, that if you want to see it at its best, then view it on Speaker View, and then you have the whole screen filled with lovely insects that Dave's going to talk about. And Fran, by the way, he's Dave and I'm David. That's the difference between the two of us tonight. Take it away, Dave.
Cool. Okay, thank you, David. So, as I was saying, I've always just been fascinated by insects. And I think lots of us go through this kind of insect phase. This is my youngest son, Seth, who, there's his pet cockchafer, Colin, he was called. He's no longer with us. They don't live terribly long, but Seth loves bugs and all kinds of insects and tries to capture them and keep them in jam jars and loves to just watch them. And so many of us do, but as I said earlier, a lot of people grow out of that kind of childhood fascination, sadly. And adults often, their reaction to insects is one of fear. If anything buzzes near them, they're more likely to squash it than anything, which is kind of sad. Because insects are, I think they're beautiful and amazing, but also they're really important, as I'm going to explain in a minute. So my kind of mission in life, if you like, is to try and persuade people to love insects, which sometimes is an uphill struggle, but I've won a few people over. Or if that's too much, to at least respect insects for what they do. And that's important because we'll get to what they do in a minute, but what really worries me is that they're disappearing at the moment. There's very clear evidence that insects are in decline, and I could show you lots of pieces of evidence, but I'm just going to show you one. This is from a study that was done in Germany. It's published in 2017, but it's based on Malaise trapping of flying insects. That funny thing top right is a Malaise trap. It looks a bit like a tent, but it catches all types of flying insects, which is most insects. And what the chart shows is the daily weight of flying insects caught per trap from 1989 to 2016. And it fell by 76%. And when this was published, it got newspaper coverage around the world, and people really sort of sat up and thought, hang on a minute, there's something really profound happening. And I think it chimed about sort of with there's one personal experience people have, which, You know, people don't pay that much attention to insects, but most people over the age of about 40 can remember a time when the windscreen of their car, or maybe when they were a kid, their dad's car, got so filthy with squashed insects in a long summer's drive that you'd have to stop to wash the windscreen. And that just doesn't happen anymore. You can drive all day on a beautiful sunny day right across Europe, and you'll hardly have a splat on your windscreen, which is worrying. Anyway, there are lots of other lines of evidence more scientific than windscreen splats, but you just take my word for it. It's pretty clear that our insects are in trouble. And that should bother us because, as I've said, they're really important creatures. And I'll explain why in a second. So there's a guy called Ed Wilson, or E.O. Wilson, who's a very, very old now, in his 90s. He's an American scientist who's actually an ant specialist. But I won't read this quote from him out in full, but he basically said if people were to disappear from the planet, it would recover beautifully without us and be absolutely fine. But as he said, if insects were to vanish, the environment would collapse into chaos, which sounds very dramatic. But I think he's right. And so I want to explain why. So firstly, insects make up the bulk of life on Earth. You know, so far we've named about 1.5 million species of animal and plant on planet Earth, of which 1.1 million are insects. So they are the bulk of life. They are biodiversity, or a lot of it. And then they're food for a big proportion of the remainder of biodiversity. This more familiar territory for David here, beautiful bee eaters, which of course eat flying insects, as do many birds and bats and freshwater fish eat insects, not flying ones so much, obviously. Frogs and toads and lizards and so on, all depend on insects for food. So if you're one of these lovely bee eaters living in Germany, say, then 3/4 of your food supplies disappeared in the last 26 years, which obviously is going to have an impact. So insects are food, but they are much more than just food. They do umpteen other things. Because there's so many different species, they're involved in more or less every kind of ecological process you might care to think of on land or in fresh water. You don't get insects in the sea. So, for example, they're really important biocontrol agents of pests, and they're recyclers of all sorts of organic materials, from dead bodies to cowpats to tree trunks and leaves and so on. And they keep the soil healthy, and they distribute the seeds of plants, and they do all sorts of things. And essentially life on Earth would grind to a halt without these little creatures. The most familiar thing, of course, that insects do for us, the thing that gets most attention, is they pollinate. They're the main group of pollinating animals on the planet. And so 87% of all the plant species on our planet need pollinating by some kind of animal. Occasionally, in some parts of the world, it might be a hummingbird or a bat, but 99% of the time it's some kind of insect. Not just bees, though. People tend to think that bees are the main pollinators, or sometimes they think they're the only pollinators. And bees are super important, but there are many thousands of other species of insect busy pollinating too. So there are butterflies and moths and lots of different species of fly and beetles and wasps and so on, all important pollinators in their way. And so from a human perspective, these pollinators are really important to our food supply, obviously. Roughly 3/4 of all the the crop varieties that we grow in the world need pollinating by some kind of insect. So we've got used to our supermarkets being kind of, replete with this amazing display of beautiful fruit and vegetables, often flown in at huge environmental costs from the other side of the world, but that's another story. But if we took away the insects, then we wouldn't have most of this lovely produce. We wouldn't have everything from apples and strawberries and raspberries to chili peppers and tomatoes and squashes, and even things like coffee and chocolate we wouldn't have without insect pollinators. So life would be grim indeed. And I mean, the horrible truth is that people would starve if we didn't have the food these things give us. So we need to understand why they're declining so that we can do something about it. There's been a lot of research done on insect declines and trying to understand them, and most scientists agree there's lots of causes of insect declines. There's no single one. It's a combination of things. Probably loss of habitat is the biggest one. But there are many others: pesticide use, spread of foreign diseases, and so on and so on. I won't go into them all now. We haven't really got time, and it's a bit depressing. I'll just say a tiny bit more about habitat loss. From an insect, and particularly from a pollinator's perspective, and looking at Europe at least, the habitat that's had the most sort of impact, or the loss of habitat that's had the most impact, has been the loss of what scientists call species-rich grasslands, but to most people are better known as hay meadows or chalk downland, which used to cover huge areas of Europe. In the UK 100 years ago, we had about 7 million hectares of this kind of habitat. And doesn't it look fantastic? That's a photograph I took in South Uist in the Outer Hebrides, which has lots of this left and is full of rare bumblebees and butterflies and all sorts of lovely things. But sadly, we destroyed 97% of that habitat by the end of the 20th century and replaced it with much more boring, from a wildlife perspective, much more boring habitats with very little diversity at all. Typically, either croplands like this, or pasture, improved pasture as it's often known, but whether it's actually improved depends very much on your perspective. From wildlife's perspective, these kind of bright green monocultures of 1 or 2 species of grass are really very boring indeed, and support barely any more biodiversity than a field of wheat, to be honest. So that's, those obviously those changes have had big effects on our insects, plus many other things that have gone on. That's enough of the doom and gloom. Let's be positive and think about what we can do about it. Well, the good news is there is loads of stuff that people can do, and this is something I really like about what I do, and focusing on insect conservation, because a lot of these big environmental issues are both depressing, and people feel powerless, helpless. I saw a few weeks ago on the news the footage of the Amazon being burnt. It's just so depressing and sad, and you feel completely unable to do anything meaningful about it. But insect conservation is very different, because they live all around us. They're in our gardens, they're in our parks, they're in the road verges that we drive along. And so things we can do will make a difference. And also, most of them haven't gone extinct yet. They're still there, and they can recover really quickly if we give them habitat. So there are at least 2 broad areas that I'm going to talk a little bit about, 2 kind of areas of where I'd love to see action to help look after our insects. And the first is the way we manage urban areas. So, of course, most of us live in urban areas, and there is a growing appetite for rewilding our gardens, for making them more wildlife friendly, for kind of inviting in nature to live with us. And I think that has huge potential to play a really significant role in stemming the loss of biodiversity generally, not just insects. If you just look at the UK, we have about 22 million individual gardens in the UK, covering an area of nearly 500,000 hectares, which is a bigger area than all the nature reserves in Britain put together. And many of those gardens are already pretty good for insect life. We know, for example, that bumblebee nests grow much faster if you put them in a garden compared to in a farmer's field. There's a much higher density of some species in urban areas. No, sorry, my phone's going. I'm hoping someone else will answer it. The perils of doing a Zoom talk from home. Oh, good. Someone's answered.
Yes, I had the doorbell go myself, actually. So.
Oh, well, what can you do? So I mean, just imagine if we could really get people to engage with this, and it's happening already. And if we could add in not just gardens, but all the other urban green spaces, if we could manage our parks for wildlife and the cemeteries and the road verges and the roundabouts and all these other green spaces, then, you know, that would really potentially create a kind of network right across the country, across Europe, of habitat for insects and wildflowers and birds and so on. So I, as you can tell, I'm quite excited about this as an idea. And I wrote another book about this, which is also a bestseller, I have to say. This is my newest book, The Garden Jungle, which is basically about how we can, how you might go about rewilding your garden. And there's just a few things I'm going to whiz through to give you some ideas. If you have a garden, I know not everybody has a garden, but even if you don't, there's a few ideas here for things you might be able to do. But if you have got a garden, you've probably got a lawn. And one of the simplest things you can do to encourage wildlife, which actually saves time and money and saves carbon emissions, is not mow as often as you used to. You know, the British people have a slight obsession with trying to recreate a kind of Wimbledon tennis court in their back garden with stripes up and down. My dad does this. He mows every couple of weeks, which is such a waste of effort and time. So if instead people could just kind of calm down a bit and learn to relax and be a bit less uptight about what their lawn looks like, instead of mowing, you know, get the deck chair out and make themselves a coffee or a gin and tonic. And watch the flowers appear. Because the amazing thing is that most lawns have got flowers in them. They just can't actually produce flowers because you keep mowing the buds off. But this is my lawn, and I've never planted any flowers in it. But if you don't mow it, then you get this. You can see there's red clover, white clover, buttercups, dandelions, self-heal, speedwell. There's all sorts of beautiful flowers already there. So I've got my own wildflower meadow just by doing nothing at all, which I think is really cool. And everyone could do that. And not just in our gardens. This picture is of a road verge in Stirling in Scotland. And it used to be a mown road verge. It used to be mown 9 times a year by the local council for no obvious reason at all. But this local campaign group that call themselves On the Verge, you can see their little logo there on the sign with this sort of slightly deranged looking psychotic bee on the front. But they're lovely people despite their logo, and they spend their weekends, they're just volunteers, many of them people who haven't got their own gardens. They spend their weekends with permission digging over any bit of amenity grassland they can get their hands on, and sowing it with wildflower seeds, and you can see the result there. Isn't that beautiful? And so that's a road version. There's a roundabout, and they've got, at the last count, 93 patches like this dotted around Stirling, which is quite a small city, including some in a primary school field, some next to a rugby pitch, and even some in a prison, which I think is kind of cool. We could do that everywhere. Wouldn't that be great if every roundabout in Europe was covered in flowers like that? In the world, wouldn't that be brilliant? Let's be ambitious. And at the opposite end, so that's fantastic, but we still see things like this, which just makes me sad and angry and frustrated. I mean, why? So just, sorry, to rewind a tiny bit, you might not know what you're looking at. I'm sure probably you do, but maybe not everybody immediately recognizes it. So this is the local council who've come along, probably a guy on a quad bike with a tank on the back full of herbicide, probably glyphosate is the herbicide, it's Roundup it's better known as. And anything green that they see growing on the pavement or the edge of paths or whatever, they spray it and kill it. You know, what harm was that little bit of grass doing? There might have been a few flowers, a bit of dandelion or two, who knows, habitat for a couple of insects. Nothing spectacular, I'm sure, but surely it was nicer when it was alive than as this pile of dead stuff. And to make matters worse, Roundup, glyphosate, there's an increasing body of evidence showing it's really harmful to wildlife and is a probable carcinogen in people. And yet we spray it where, in parks, in playgrounds, in places where our kids play, where our dogs sniff, and it just seems absolutely mad to me. And again, why can't we just be a little bit more tolerant of life living around us? So personally, I would ban pesticides in urban areas, in gardens, in parks, completely. And actually, there's an appetite for that. There are cities that have already done it. Toronto banned pesticides 20 years ago. Paris last year banned all pesticides in urban areas. Why can't we do it? We can, we could, we would. There's really no price to pay for getting rid of these things, and huge benefits to be had. You might be thinking, if you're a keen gardener, you might be thinking, but what am I going to do if I get a load of aphids on my runner beans or my roses or whatever? Well, I would say, and this is what I do, is absolutely nothing. And you'd be amazed that, generally speaking, within a few days, this army of little helpers come along. The cavalry comes charging over the hill. These are all predators of aphids that you will find in a garden. There are many, many more. You've got lacewings and ladybirds and hoverflies and parasitoid wasps and earwigs and so on. All of them love to eat aphids. So if you don't spray, chances are these things will come along. And I find 9 years out of 10, the aphids get wiped out very effectively and I get a good crop. Just occasionally, it doesn't seem to work. But, worse things have happened. I'd still rather have a few less runner beans and a few aphids in the garden than spray a bunch of poison around. So don't use the pesticides. And while we're talking about being more tolerant, I'd love it if people didn't spend so much time trying to persecute weeds. There are certain plants we've decided are kind of unwelcome aliens, and we spend an awful lot of time trying to get rid of them, which is kind of odd because we then spend an awful lot of time and energy trying to grow other plants that we've decided we do like. And it's completely arbitrary, the ones we've decided are weeds and the ones we've decided are desirable ornamental plants. Because as you can see, these are all weeds, but I think they're beautiful. They're just as beautiful as the things that we try to grow. So, be a little more tolerant. Leave a few dandelions. In fact, maybe it's a little bit cheesy, but my top gardening tip is you can get rid of all the weeds in your garden just like that by just calling them wildflowers and being done. Incidentally, really, all three of these, ragwort, spear thistle, dandelion, all fantastic plants for pollinators. Of course, you probably in your garden will want some more traditional garden flowers, and there are loads of beautiful flowers to choose from that are really good for wildlife too. So you don't have to have a kind of drab garden full of nettles and brambles for it to be good for wildlife. You can have a beautiful garden. Generally, things like traditional cottage garden flowers tend to be really good. Herbs are often good. There's loads of advice out there, including my books and YouTube videos that I've made about best garden flowers for pollinators and so on. One thing although there's lots of advice out there on which plants are good for insects, it will tend to not be all that specific. So, for example, lots of lists of good plants for pollinators will tell you that catmint, which is what this is a good plant for pollinators. But actually, there's been recent research comparing different varieties of catmint, and some are much, much better than others. So it's quite useful if you know that to buy the best ones. So, for example, with catmint, if you're going to go to a garden centre and buy some or buy a pack of seeds, go for 6 Hills Giant, because in trials that performed better than any other kind of catmint. And so similarly, just one other example, there are loads of different lavenders on sale. But this one, Gros Bleu, came out top in terms of numbers of insects it attracts. I obviously haven't got time to go through all of those. So I wrote another book. Sorry, this one isn't out yet. 20th of April next year is coming out, which has all the details about exactly which varieties are best and so on. Anyway, sorry, I keep self-publicizing. Do beware when you're buying plants. There is a slight issue over the plants sold in garden centres. So 3 years ago, we did some research on the pesticides in garden centre plants. We were kind of tipped off that these plants are often reared with lots of pesticides to make them look perfect. You know, they're hard to sell if they've got chewed leaves or blemishes or whatever. Just like the fruit in supermarket shelves, you know, people won't buy it if it's got any signs of insect damage or imperfection, which is kind of sad actually, but that's another story. So we specifically, we drove around all the big name garden centres in the south of England near Brighton, places like Vale and B&Q and so on. And we bought the plants that were specifically the ones they were selling as bee friendly. They had logos on them, either bee friendly, you can see down the bottom there, or they were using the RHS Perfect for Pollinator logo as another popular one. Deliberately trying to sell plants to people who want to make their gardens insect friendly. And the horrible truth is 75% of those bee-friendly plants had insecticides in the nectar and pollen, which is quite alarming really, and surely contravenes kind of trade descriptions and so on. So actually, don't go to the garden centre and buy Six Hill Giant or Gros Bleu or whatever. Better to grow them from seed, or find an organic nursery. There are some around, including some online. Or do plant swaps with your friends and neighbours. It's much more sustainable than buying loads of plants, probably reared in peat-based compost, probably sold in disposable plastic pots as well. There's all whole other issues there I could go into. Anyway, just bear that in mind next time you're thinking of getting some new plants for the garden. Bear also in mind, and this you might think, what on earth am I going on about here? Going off on a real tangent. But you might well be an organic gardener. You might well use no pesticides at all on your plants and so on. But many nature lovers are also pet owners with a dog or a cat. And if you are, then you will almost certainly have been advised by your vet to treat them against fleas. Prophylactically, your vet will encourage you to treat your dog or cat every month with stuff that you drip on the back of their neck. And this is the best-selling brand in Europe, Advocate, which has an active ingredient, which my mouse is a little arrow there is showing. You probably can't read it, but it says imidacloprid. That's an insecticide. It's a neurotoxic insecticide. It's actually a thing called a neonicotinoid, which is a class of insecticides that have become famous for the harm they did to the environment. And they've been banned in Europe for farming use, but they're still available to drip on your family pet, which is pretty alarming because the amounts you put on the pet are large. So for example, the monthly dose that you're supposed to drip on a medium-sized dog is enough to kill 60 million honeybees. That would be enough honeybees to fill 4 long wheelbase lorries with dead bees. That's a lot of dead bees. And that's every month on every dog and every cat if you follow your vet's advice. It's pretty concerning because these chemicals are long lasting and they're water soluble. So your dog goes out in the rain and drips on the lawn or in the garden flowers or whatever. That's a huge dose of insecticide going into the environment. Or worse still, if your dog jumps in a river and goes for a swim, as many dogs do when you take them for a walk. And just 2 weeks ago, we published a paper showing levels of imidacloprid and fipronil, which is another compound that's used in these flea treatments, in British rivers. And basically 100% of the rivers sampled I say British, should say English. We don't have samples from outside of England. 100% of the rivers sampled came up positive for these flea treatments going on to dogs. And the red ones are ones with really high levels, which exceed the safe levels for these chemicals. So they're going to be basically killing the insects in those rivers, which is really worrying. So anyway, bear that in mind. If we want to look after the insects, we obviously need to avoid poisoning our rivers like that. Okay, so that's the end of my bit about farming, about gardening. But then I did say I was going to talk about 2 areas where we might help insects. And I just want to finish off by saying a little bit about farming, which is, in a way, it's a much tougher nut to crack. It's quite easy, I think, to get people to make urban areas wildlife friendly, and it's already happening, and it's fantastic. But unfortunately, for example, in the UK, 70% of the UK is farmland. And unfortunately, much of that is really quite hostile to life of all types. And so I think we need to think, is there a better way of growing food? Obviously, we need to feed everybody. And there's a lot of us these days, and there's going to be more of us in the future, maybe 10, 11, 12 billion by 2050. And I think many people have accepted that sort of industrialized agriculture is the only way to feed everybody, and the people will starve if we don't do this. But actually, I think the opposite is true. I think if we carry on doing this, people will starve because it's not sustainable. And I say that because industrial farming produces about a third, and well, the food production system generally, globally, including food transport, contributes about a third of all greenhouse gas emissions, as much as energy production globally, which isn't sustainable. We need to cut down. It's causing massive soil erosion. There was a recent estimate suggesting that we're losing about 23 billion tons of topsoil a year, topsoil that takes thousands of years to replace because of the way we're treating it. And the third thing that farming is doing that's not sustainable is it's wiping out biodiversity, including the natural enemies that otherwise could control the crop pests and the pollinators that farmers need to pollinate the crops. So if we carry on, we're going to end up with a wrecked climate, no soil and no pollinators, which seems like a recipe for disaster to me. So do we need all this industrial farming? Well, actually, we don't. Right now, if you look at the total amount of food grown in the world, we grow about 3 times as many calories as we'd need to feed everybody. But very crudely and swiftly, we throw away a third of it. We waste a third of all. So we do all this intensive farming, that's so damaging to the environment. And then we just casually waste a third of the produce, which is nuts. And surely we could do better. And then another third gets fed to animals to feed to people. And I'm not here to preach to be vegan or vegetarian, because I'm neither, but I think we should try and cut down on meat production and meat consumption and see it as a treat. Something to have once or twice a week rather than something to have every day, as people often do. And if we cut down on waste and cut down on meat consumption, and sorry about this next picture, but if we just cut down on overconsumption, the excessive eating of stuff that's bad for us, and eating way more than we need, then actually we could set aside huge areas of what is currently farmland for nature. Just imagine if we could get rid of food waste. Of course, we can't get rid of all of it, but just suppose, just for the sake of argument, that one thing would mean that a third of all the farmland in the world could be turned back over into some huge rewilding project, which would just be amazing. I mean, that's an area about the size of North America. If we could tackle the animal, the meat consumption and the overconsumption as well, then you've got even bigger gains. But what's more, I think there are other ways of growing food that we should explore. So what do we need from a farming system that's actually properly sustainable? We need farming that looks after the soil, that captures carbon in the soil, that looks after the biodiversity, the natural enemies of the crop pests and the pollinators, that doesn't rely on poisoning the environment with pesticide, and that produces a healthy diet for us, which is obviously the fundamental point of farming in the first place, is growing lots of fruit and veg, ideally, because that's what's actually good for us. And there are types of farming like that are really productive and already successful. Things like agroforestry, which comes in various forms, which basically involves mixing tree crops with either animals or vegetable crops, or permaculture, or biodynamic farming. I recently went round a biodynamic farm near me in Sussex in the south of England, and it's just amazing. They produce this huge range of produce, which they sell without any pesticides, any artificial fertilizers, and they sell them to local people in their farm shop. And the whole thing is so much more sustainable than the kind of industrial farm model. Biodynamic farmers do have a bit of kind of witchcraft mixed in as well, but anyway, we'll leave that for another day. On the whole, it works. So just to wrap up, this is very cliche, but you know, this is our home. This is this extraordinary rock hurtling through space with, you know, 1.5 million species of animal and plant clinging to its surface. It gives us everything we have: food, water, somewhere to live, source of inspiration and beauty, and so on. We're not going to go and live on Mars anytime soon. So, you know, why on earth aren't we looking after our planet better? I think we can and we have to, and we need to ensure. You know, I always think it's really strange that people would do anything for their kids or their grandkids, apart from leave them a decent planet to live on. Isn't that weird? Anyway, we can do better, and maybe we can start by looking after all the little creatures that live in our gardens. Thank you. That's it from my ramble. 33 minutes, slightly over time, but only slightly.
Listen, I could have listened for another 2-3 hours. Brilliant, Dave. Brilliant. Absolutely found it.
Anytime. Pleasure.
No, seriously, it's a fantastic way to end our In Conservation With series. But the thing is, it left a lot of sobering thoughts, really, because, you know, firstly, you know, we don't need, because when people think about saving, you know, nature and conservation, they think about, oh, it's got to be a massive area fenced off, you know, no one can go there, but where's that going to be? But in reality, it can start from our little postage stamp back garden and just have a little tiny corner. Because it's interesting, you think about this massive size of reserves and stuff, but when you actually think about it again, you know, insects and plants, a lot of them are quite small, and those little tiny areas are jungles, you know, and they offer the opportunity for a huge range of array of biodiversity, which people just don't realize. And I think that's one thing that's not being transmitted to people enough. I mean, you talked about lockdown earlier. I noticed, as everyone else did, that people were aware of nature more, which was great. I also felt that the media didn't do enough to kind of fill in the gaps in terms of letting people know, well, actually, that's great, but just imagine if we kept that going, you know, how good it would be for us. And going down to the fact that, you know, I was in lockdown in Spain, for example, and when I went to the local shop, there's a small pocket park, and they allowed the grass to grow, and it was incredible. Buzzing of insects, lots of birds and butterflies and that sort of stuff. The moment lockdown was, you know, stopped, all of it shaved down within an inch of his life. Why? You know, it's just...
Sad, isn't it? I find it so frustrating. But it is changing, you know. The Plant Life, which is a charity that devoted to plant conservation in the UK, they've had a big campaign in the last 2 years to try and get road verge cutting reduced and councils to sign up. And some local councils are really on board with it. Lots aren't still. And there's also a battle with public perception, because if the verges aren't cut, if the parks aren't cut, some people complain. You know, they write letters. They think the council's being lazy. It's, you know, deserted its duty of keeping everywhere neat and tidy. And that, obviously, it's kind of sad that people think that, and it needs some education to point out to people the benefits of not mowing all the time, and make them realize it's actually a positive thing to do rather than it just being laziness. But we're getting there, which is kind of nice to see.
It is. We have a lot of questions in the chat. So what I'm going to do, we're going to close early and then we'll go straight to Q&A, I think, because otherwise we'll be talking well over the hour. So let me quickly ask you, Dave, can you let me know what your favorite invertebrate is?
Oh, well, yeah, I hate to be really predictable, but I'm going to have to go for a bumblebee. Because they're beautiful, they're really important, they're really clever. I didn't go into that tonight, but that's what first got me hooked in studying them. But not just any bumblebee. I'm going to go for the shrill carder bumblebee, which is it's England's rarest bumblebee. It's sadly quite close to extinction in the UK. And it's a rather beautiful little insect, and it's named because it has a higher pitched buzz than the average bumblebee, so you can hear one and tell there's one nearby before you see it. Really endearing little bees. So yeah, not most people will have never seen one, sadly, or heard one, but there are a few left, and I hope they can persist.
Right, and notwithstanding the current unfortunate pandemic, if you could be anywhere, and if there were flights or tunnels to go under, if you could be anywhere on this planet right now, where would you be?
So it's a miserable time of year, isn't it? And so I've completely gone off the idea of long haul flights, mainly just because I can't bear to sit still for so long, but also because of the sort of huge environmental cost. But if you could invent a teleporter that would take me there, I would go to Tasmania right now, because it's a beautiful island. I've done field work studying introduced bumblebees there. It's kind of quite a wild place. Feels like the end of the world, really, or the edge of the world, I should say, rather than the end of the world. And right now, you know, they have fantastic long days. It's midsummer. It's just a day after Midsummer's Day. A beautiful place. I could highly recommend it, aside from the environmental cost of getting there.
You know what? You're the first person ever to mention Tasmania. And also, it's one of the places I would love to go to. In fact, I only went there a couple of years ago, but it fell through. And it's one of those places as a kid I wanted to go to. But anyway, Zoomers, just to let you know that this is indeed the last of the current 2020 in conservation widths, but we come back fresh after the New Year's celebration of sorts on January the 4th with a young lady called Corina Newsom, who's an Afro-American. She's all about getting people of color into nature in the US. The following day, on Tuesday the 5th, we've got Catherine Hamilton, who's an amazing artist, a bird artist and birder as well. So she'll be talking about her art. On Wednesday the 6th of January, we got Wendy Clark, who is currently the publisher of Birdwatchers Digest in the US, and she's also a marketeer. So she'll be talking about her efforts to spread the word, certainly in America. On Thursday the 7th, Benedict, or Ben McDonald, he is a guy who works in TV, but he's going to be talking about urban rewilding and combating ecological tidiness disorder, which is something that Dave has touched on tonight. So that's on Thursday the 7th. And then the following week, the 11th, 12th, and 13th, is taken over by the youth. Maya Bambrick, who's normally here helping me out, will actually be hosting that week, and I'll be helping her out. And she'll be talking to 3 notable young conservationists during that week. So basically a lot of stuff coming up, and plus there'll be more names to be added. So I hope you stick with us. So Dave, once again, it's been absolutely brilliant, fantastic. Looking forward to talking more with you in the future about stuff like this. It's really, really good. Thank you very much for bringing this all up to us.
My pleasure.
And Zoomers, it's been great to have you around as well. Looking forward to seeing you all in 2021. Be safe and have a good Christmas as much as you can, wherever you are, and keep looking up.